Hello, welcome to your webinar on developing a competency-based HR system. My name is Lito Lupena. So before we start with the content, I just wanted to share something about me. I've been a practitioner of HR and OD for around 25 years already, and I've done significant work in competencies just by the time it was getting some traction in the Philippine setting. That was around early 90s. These are some of the organizations that I've worked with, setting up or asking, querying about competencies. Most recently, I've extended the work from private into the public sector, and I'm assuming that maybe because this is a CSC sponsored webinar, there are a number of you who are from the public sector. So in terms of coverage, in this 1 hour, what we're going to focus on is number one, I'm going to talk about the value of a competency-based HR. Like why should you get into a competency-based HR? What would be the benefits? What would be the impact to how you conduct or organize your HR today? And hopefully this one gives you the impetus to want to really get into competency-based HR. Number two, we're going to talk about some of the key elements of a competency model. For some of you who've already been exposed to competency modeling, it can get complicated because of the many requirements or seeming many requirements of a model. So I'm just going to talk about the ones that are essential that you cannot live without in trying to set up a model. And then finally, number three, the elements, or sorry, the how you begin developing or organizing your own approach towards a competency-based HR. Now, as we proceed here, you are welcome to ask questions already, but we will be compiling them and we will be answering them towards the end of this presentation. If at some point the questions seem logical to be answered or included in the discussion already, I'll go ahead with that. But for most of us, we're going to put that towards the end. So number one, the value of a competency-based HR. Now, to understand this, of course, to contextualize this, we need to take a step back and maybe ask, how is our current HR system working right now? And then from here, we contrast what the value of a competency-based system introduces to our current system. So instead of focusing on the 11 functional groups of HR, I'm going ahead and talk about just maybe the 4 key pillars of HR, specifically recruitment, performance management, rewards management, and learning and development. So for recruitment, just a quick question. When recruiting, do you feel you have the complete picture of a vacancy's job requirements? So here, the complete picture, we mean we go beyond the usual requirements of education or any of the certifications or other qualification standards or requirements. So so is this complete? If it is, then maybe you are already doing a little bit of competency and you didn't know about that. But if it's not complete, a competency-based system approach to recruitment will provide you some opportunities here. Number two, do your interviews focus on critical competencies, or do you end up having interviews wherein questions come out of nowhere, and when you try to link it to capability, the linkage is not so clear? And this is the usual exercise, for example, for many recruiters who end up not preparing or not knowing what it is that I want to focus on or ask as questions before I get into a interview. And finally, number three, do you have a systematic interview process? And if your answers to these are mostly yes or no, we'll find out towards the end of this discussion. Number two, we're going to talk about performance management this time. First question, is there an understanding of what is monitored and measured in performance among your employees? Are there, for example, discussions outside of your performance discussions where some employees feel they were not fair, they were not objective kind of measurements? So they're either surprised or they were not aware that those were the standards for performance. Number three, do you know which behaviors are causing a person's performance on the job? And what is the impact of that behavior to performance? Is it contributing? Is it the one preventing? Is it the one causing that challenges? And finally, are you able to identify reasons for gaps in performance? So very quickly, just top of mind or on a sheet of paper beside you, just write yes or no, what your answers to these questions. Next, let's move into learning and development. Do your development programs focus on skills, knowledge, and characteristics that have the most impact on effectiveness? Or are people also, on the other hand, are people requesting for training programs, development programs that at best you don't know how it relates or it connects to their key performance or requirements or outcomes? And number two, is there a framework by which you can base ongoing coaching and feedback? Last, in your rewards management, do employees have incentives when they develop certain knowledge, skills, and attitude beyond what is required? Or let's say the value that they add over initial requirements in performing a job? And number two, do employees aim for growth and personal development independent of leaders, or is there high dependency on leaders for development? So I hope you spend some time going through the questions and answering or thinking about them. Definitely, when you do your review later on, you want to revisit this question again and try to go deeper into answering them if it is in the affirmative, your current practice or not. But if now you have a yes or no to each of these, the answer simply is that if on a positive level you feel you are, in terms of recruitment, learning development, then my message is it's good for you. Your current HR system is somehow integrated and is producing for you the right results and effective results. However, if most of your answers or some of your answers center or lean towards the no, the negative, then that means you might benefit from a system that is tightly integrated and will bring about effective results in the HR. And that's where the value of competency-based HR comes in. It's a framework by which you can integrate all of the processes in HR, not just the key pillar processes, but even all processes in HR. Let me walk you through an illustration of that. So let's say, still with the four basic pillars of the HR function. Let's talk about recruitment, performance, development, and rewards. Currently, in terms of the questions that we asked earlier or in practice across many organizations today, you might have differing standards for recruitment. For example, in some organizations, their qualification standard or qualification requirements might focus on, let's say, education or a specific number of hours, things like that. So those are standards that you want your ideal applicant to pass. And based on that, you do hire them. But once they enter in the organization and begin doing performance, suddenly you now have a different requirement based on KPIs. So the KPIs, the performance indicators or key result areas that you look for are not aligned with your qualification standards. I hope you're getting the picture. You recruit based on education, but then your requirement is for or your performance requirements, your result areas require certain capabilities which were not illustrated or specified by that education. And then number three, once you develop them, you now focus on other skills. And then maybe by reward, it's through other standards. Like some organizations, I, I experience or I see that one of their policies is to reward attendance. When you ask deeply, where is attendance connected in terms of capability? Just because a person shows up every day, is that an indicator that they are smart? Is that an indication that they are dedicated? Is that an indication that they are producing results? Because someone can show up every day at work and not really be productive. So that's a different standard altogether. So while it might seem that these standards are working for each of the functions, know that because they are different standards, here represented by different shapes and different colors, across the HR functions, they're not integrated. So your employee is confused about, I was hired for this standard. Why am I being required to perform under this standard? Why am I being developed under this standard? And why is my reward different from that? So they're not talking to each other. The value of a competency-based HR system, obviously, is one wherein your standards for recruitment, instead of being different, so it's isolated from performance, or you need to go through hoops and bounds to get them connected. Your basis might be competencies, performance, managing that, basis is competencies, development, basis is competencies, and even reward based on competencies. If this is the premise of your HR system, then guess what? You have a strong functional HR unit for each of these, but at the same time, you have a strong connection across all of these units. It's the same standard when you were hired, when you're continually being developed, the same standard when you're being developed, and the same standard that you are rewarded for. And that's a key value of a competency-based HR. However, and this is more or less a significant discussion today. How many are actually benefiting from competencies? Well, we actually did a study wherein we found out that across many organizations, and this study is around 400 organizations. Of the 400 organizations that we surveyed, around 64% of them have no competency-based program. They have no competency initiative, or at best, it's an ad hoc approach, or it's just HR doing this competency work, and the entire organization is not yet embracing or moving into actual competency practice. So we are not yet doing it, so that's very significant. We also found out, however, that there were 28 who are considering working to define a competency-based system. And some of them in this definition or in this installation, they are experiencing some governance challenges and limited communication. So somehow we separated this and said that while they are implementing it, it's not as successful. Which brings us to the last figure, 8%, which is really where organizations stand right now. Just a small percentage of organizations have a competency system that's aligned to the business, supported by a framework, has established profiles and scales and governance. So it's a small sample. However, of these 8%, we are seeing tremendous benefits in their HR functions. For example, in this 8%, we found that they felt not only HR, but the effect goes far beyond HR. 55% of them say they've increased revenue because of a competency model. It was clear to them that this is how we produce the revenue, or this is how we produce the performance, by acquiring certain capabilities. If those capabilities weren't specified, then they wouldn't know what skill to improve so as to produce increased revenue. We found out also that 45% again have increased customer retention. They now know which competency contributes to getting customers returning or retaining them, or maybe even buying more. Versus before, without the competency standard, they didn't know what skill do we focus on that will get us to retain customers. We also found out 45% increased market penetration because now they can leverage on the competencies that really drive real customer engagement. 41% also increased customer satisfaction. And finally, 37% increased employee engagement. For those of you aware about employee engagement, it's very important that employees are engaged, because engagement has been correlated with organization productivity. The less engaged employees are, the less productive an organization is. So this 37%, while it looks small as a number, it has significant effects to ultimately your organization's outcomes. So that's the value, and this is why you might want to get into a competency-based HR system. Number one, it strengthens each of your functional units in HR, and number two, it connects all of your functions in HR, and number three, it produces for you results far more significant than the value for HR alone, but for the organization itself. So how do we start this? Well, before we get into the development of an HR system, it's important that we talk about what comprises a competency model. What elements do we need to put in the picture? So here, that's where we're going to talk about this now. In terms of elements, the basic requirement for a competency model is what you call a construct. Now, this is a psychology term, of course, but here, every time I mention construct, know that I'm referring to either dimensions or competencies. So a competency is simply a construct. This construct is defined by a question such as why. So why are you implementing a competency model? Some organizations, for example, they end up saying, I want to define a competency model because I want to improve performance. So the question here, what are the constructs, the dimensions that you require to improve such performance? Some organizations construct or make a competency framework because they want to achieve the strategy. So again, what are the constructs or dimensions that you require for your organization to achieve its strategy? And also, maybe for some organizations, not too lofty, not too high a goal, but very simply, I want to improve the behavior of employees because behavior ultimately influences performance. And if so, what would be your constructs or dimensions for behavior? Let me give an illustration. So let's say your why is I want to achieve the organization's strategy. So the next step is you want to ask what are the constructs, what are the dimensions that will allow you to achieve your strategy. And maybe one of the constructs that you end up thinking is problem solving. Maybe your strategy is I want to sell this much, or I want to have improved customer satisfaction. And currently, right now, that's a dilemma. So your first construct in mind is problem solving. You feel problem solving will be the one that resolves that strategic dilemma. So now you have your first construct, your first dimension, your first competency. So notice here, the why is the important question. And then after that, you define your constructs. Once you've identified your construct or your competency or your dimension, you want to begin articulating those competencies. And to articulate them will require you to identify your standards. Now, the word I use here again is standards, but in other practices, the term they use is either criteria or behavior. So maybe in the presentations later, I might interchange that, but know that when I say construct, I refer to competencies or dimensions, and when I say standards, I refer to behaviors or criteria. And your criteria for problem solving might be, let's say, breaks down problems into their component parts, or refers to manuals, flowcharts, and policies, or tests assumptions to determine root cause of problems. As standards, they serve as indicators for the construct being present. In other words, if you use this later on to assess an individual and you find an individual is not able to break down problems, or that individual cannot refer to manuals, or that individual is not able or unable to test assumptions, then our conclusion is that individual is not able to demonstrate the construct or the dimension, which means because he or she is not able to demonstrate the construct, it impacts your initial why, the strategy. So you don't achieve the strategy because people are not demonstrating problem solving, specifically breaking down problems into their component parts, referring to manuals, flowcharts, policies to resolve dilemmas, and test assumptions to determine root cause of problems. So this is the standard for problem solving, at least in our demonstration today. When we talk about another organization, they might have the same construct, but they might have different standards. As an example, when you go to a company such as Google, their standards might be higher than the standards here. If you go to a company that doesn't have, and I don't know if there's a company that doesn't have problems, but they don't have problems. They might have not three, but maybe just one single standard, not a lot. Maybe to illustrate this further, I can talk about one organization wherein I was asked to conduct an assessment. And in that assessment, they wanted me to focus particularly on a competency called effective communication. The construct was effective communication. Now, in that assessment, I didn't ask if they had standards yet for that competency. I just went ahead and looked at some of the evidence that could give me an idea of how they were in that competency. One of the documents that I ended up reading, the written report went this way. The mountain moved from the left to the right, cannot go, cannot back, the people scattered. Now, I'm not, I'm really good in English. So this is just an example. This was the document that I saw. So that was what was written. Top of mind, of course, when you read a document such as that, your concern is that, or your conclusion might be, this person, the one who wrote this, is not able to demonstrate effective communication, because in my mind, in your mind, maybe it doesn't meet any of the certain standards that we know about or we typically attribute to communication, such as number one, we don't see any coherence in the statements. Number two, there seems to be no logic. Maybe number three, grammar is not followed. So if you convert these to standards, then those standards might be, number one, writes in a cohesive and coherent manner. Number two, illustrates a logical sequence of statements. Or number three, follows the rules of grammar. But again, these are our standards. Any organization might have its own standards. So in before producing my assessment, my evaluation, I asked this organization, "Do you have your own competency framework?" And they said yes. "Do you have standards for one of your competencies called communication?" The answer was yes, and I asked them, "Can you show me?" Lo and behold, they didn't have three standards. They didn't have the same standards that I had at a personal level, like cohesion, clarity, logic, and grammar. Their standard was just simply writes in a casual and conversational manner. So meaning they weren't looking for cohesion, they weren't looking for grammar, they weren't looking for logic. So long as far as they were concerned, so long as the writing or the communication that you produce is casual enough and conversational enough, that meets their requirements. And in this case, the document or the report that when the mountain moved from the left to the right, cannot go, cannot back, the people scattered, suddenly becomes an indication that, well, this individual is competent in communication. Because as far as the organization was concerned, they were demonstrating the required standard. And that's how standards are. And again, it differs. If we use the same standard of cohesion, logic, and grammar, and let's say we're a call center, those might not be sufficient. Maybe a standard that you'll have on top of those three standards will be talks in a language that sounds like Native American. So again, the dynamics or the context of your organization by which you require a construct uh, produces differentiated standards. But it's these standards precisely that you end up using to implement the rest of HR. For example, in the context of recruitment, if a candidate is not able to break down, or if a candidate, someone you're interviewing, is able to break down problems, refer to manuals, or test assumptions, then that's your right candidate. You can use this for performance, wherein you require everybody to demonstrate this competency. And if they don't, then you also now know who is that person that you need to focus on for coaching or mentoring. Or even in learning development, you also now know whoever is matching these standards or not matching in this example, then you also know which employee you want to focus on. So that's the beauty of a competency model. And the elements are very simple. It's just the construct and the standards. Now, currently, right now, in what you're seeing as a slide, I'm just focusing on one standard right now. And again, there could be many standards. How do you come up with the standards? Maybe that's your question. You can come up with standards by talking about your high performers. How do your high performers behave? And if you aspire for your other employees to behave the way your high performers do, and in certain constructs, then they could be a good basis. So simply follow them, observe them, and then take note of their behaviors. Then, if you say this is a compelling standard that I want for everybody else, then that becomes your source for that standard. Sometimes you can also develop standards based on your aspirations, especially if you find there is no one in the organization who demonstrates good problem solving. Then your model is somebody outside of the organization. So you can look at leaders or other performers that have better behaviors that you would like to emulate under a category or construct. If aspirations are also not available, you can convene an expert panel. So in an expert panel, you brainstorm what behaviors do we want regarding or relative to this construct or this competency. What behaviors are ideal? What do we want to see our employees to do or to act out? And finally, if none of these are available, and you can't say that these are not, because there will always be a high performer in one construct or another. You will always have an aspiration over one construct or another, and there are always a set of experts in our organization that talk or have standards about a certain construct. The last one is your requirements, or I wrote down requirements, but the right word that I wanted, the other word I wanted to use here was frustration. So if you're frustrated, that means there's a behavior that is not present. So that behavior that's not present is your standard. If, for example, a behavior you're not seeing is people coming on time, then your standard is comes to work on time. But that standard, of course, doesn't belong to problem solving. It belongs in another construct or dimension. Or if, for example, one of your frustrations is people right now, when they encounter problems, they don't use a process-based approach to analyzing the root cause. Then simply convert that frustration into your behavioral standard, which might read uses tools or uses a systematic based approach in discovering the root cause of problems. So if you notice, we have four approaches here by which you can end up defining standards. And you want to define standards for all of the competencies that you feel are important for you to achieve your why, to achieve your strategy, or to achieve behavior, or to achieve certain performance requirements. Currently, it's just problem solving that we're talking about. But again, you can have a lot more competencies relative to a why. So, for example, to achieve the strategy, we want everybody to be able to solve problems. We want everybody to analyze. We want everybody to communicate. We want everybody to plan. And sometimes these competencies might differ from one position to another in terms of requirements. For example, let's illustrate a one position. Position one, in terms of its mandates, key result areas, maybe the competencies we require from them are just the following: problem solving, analysis, communication, decision making, and recruitment. Planning is not a requirement of this job, and maybe we can guess maybe this is a non-supervisory work. Innovation is not required. Maybe this position, in terms of its functional responsibility, it doesn't require that. However, for another position, again, you might have differing requirements. This time, you do require accounting versus recruitment, but at the same time, you also don't require planning or innovation. Maybe you have one more position wherein the requirements are far differentiated because now planning is part of what you expect and innovation. So these we call them profiles. So this is the profile of position A. The profile is comprised of 5 competencies versus position C. The profile is a combination of 6 competencies. And these competencies, the standards for each of them might also differentiate. Now, based on this, of course, now we're seeing a particular behavior about the requirements. You will find that problem solving is a competency that we are requiring across all of the positions in our example here. If you find a competency such as this that keeps on recurring um, in many of your positions in your organization, you might end up saying that, or in competency parlance, we call this treat this as your foundation competencies because it's all positions that are expected to demonstrate that. In other schools, they might call this as core competencies rather than foundation. But in current practice, you only call a competency core if it's related to your mandate. Such as if you were an IT company, your core competency would be IT related competencies. If you were a recruitment firm, your key competencies, your core competencies would be recruitment. And not everybody will be required to demonstrate recruitment. However, for competencies such as problem solving, it's global. So instead of calling it core, the right term is actually foundation. And maybe another competency, which here in our example, planning, is distinctly applicable to one position. We can call it leadership, especially if position C is a leadership position. Of course, that competency will never appear in position A and position B if they happen to be non-leadership positions. And then one more competency, which is distinctly functional related. Let's say position A is a recruitment officer position. Position A is a recruitment officer position. Position B is an accounting officer position, and maybe position C is an IT position. Then you know that that competency, which was very related to their functional area, is actually a technical or a functional competency. We call these competency types. In current practice today, many organizations are not differentiating competencies anymore if they are foundation, leadership, or technical. They simply say these are the competencies required. So you can think of these types as a way just to cluster and group competencies together. So some competencies are grouped together as foundation competencies because you require them from all, or some competencies are termed leadership because they only appear or become required for leadership positions. So again, those are some other elements that you might require or want to see in a competency model: profiles and competency types. So it's the zero domino, of course, are your constructs and your standards. Your constructs are identified through a question of why. Why? Why are we building a competency model? Because we want to achieve our strategy. If you want to achieve your strategy, what are your constructs? What are your dimensions? After you define your dimensions, you define the standards for each of the dimensions. After defining each of the standards, then you might proceed and create your profiles and maybe your competency groupings. So now that we have a basic run through of the elements of competencies, now we want to begin developing them. Now, just to maybe take a step back and maybe illustrate another point, because somebody was asking, how do you measure a competency? But because competencies are expressed in the behavioral term, of course, the better measure is actually to observe. In competency parlance, we have what we call 4 degrees of measurement. The first degree of measurement is inference, meaning because we saw a person solve a problem, we begin inferring that maybe this person has problem solving skills. And sometimes this inference can come in the form, or we might infer these things from is reading a resume. In the resume, someone might have said, I solved critical problems of the organization. And based on that promise, we say maybe that's a good enough proof that a person can solve problems. But be careful because that's not, you didn't see the person actually demonstrate problem solving skills. So at best, it's really just an inference. Next to that is reported behavior, wherein somebody said or Somebody said somebody solved a problem. And then lastly, another is after that, measured when you compare them as standards. So the better measures, the better ways of measuring competency are usually assessment centers, simulations, and demonstrations. The not so effective ways of measuring competencies are through tests or screening CVs or screening bio data. So those are one, right? Let me jump ahead and go back to our earlier slide. So because the constructs emanate from a question such as, how do I achieve my strategy? And in answer to that, you say, I will achieve my strategy if everybody is able to either plan, analyze, problem solve. If you reverse that equation, simply the success of your strategy is dependent on your employees demonstrating the competencies. And the competencies, again, are illustrated by standards. So this gives you a very clear line of relationship that if people produce the standards of the constructs that were necessary for the why, then you know that you end up being productive if the standards definitely are being demonstrated. So there's actually a high relationship of competencies and standards to an organization's productivity. So how do we develop a competency-based HR? Well, we learned about that. We learned about constructs and standards. So that's the basic element of how you develop a competency framework. And these standards, just to clarify again, might be differentiated from one to another, one position and another position. So you might call the previous set as your level 1 standards and your other set as your level 2 standards. In current practice today, the best practice, and if you're going to do competencies today, you actually are in a much better position. When I was doing this in the 90s, the model or the structure by which we created standards and these levels, they were much more confusing. For one competency, there were 7 standards. For another competency, there were 2 standards. Today, however, when you talk of standards, when you talk of levels, the best practice is 4 standards. And these standards, again, in this illustration, might be different, or some standards may simply be the same, except they change in terms of either scale or difficulty, autonomy, or so. So those are that's our lesson on that. So how do we do this? The first step again is called discovery. In discovery, you want to ask the why. After that is the actual development proper of competencies. Then after that is profiling, or what you call the assessment process. In discovery, the first step is to think about the context. Again, why am I creating a competency framework? Is it for me to achieve my strategy? Is it just to improve the performance of certain positions? Is it just to change behaviors of certain individuals? And that establishes that context. After identify your context, then that's when you begin developing or hypothesizing your constructs, your dimensions, your competencies. Each of these, sometimes the context alone requires several people to get an agreement. And maybe when it comes to constructs also, it takes several people to agree on what are the key constructs that are really relevant for us. After you identify that, after discovery, then you move into development, wherein you revisit your constructs, and from the constructs, you develop your standards. What are the ways by which we begin measuring the constructs? What are the behaviors that we want? And again, maybe several people need to come together in a room to define these standards. Just think about it. For one competency such as, let's say, analysis, one person might have a different set of standards. Let's say that person will say, I want people to use Excel. Another person might have a different set of standards for analysis. Maybe they say, I want them to use statistical formulas. And maybe yet for another person, maybe their standard is I want them to use actual statistical formulas such as Pearson, Spearman, ANOVA. If you have three different standards, it's hard to use them when you begin assessing because these standards should be unified and in agreement across all who expect that behavior. So standards definition alone is actually a long process. And just to give you a view, in many of the organizations that I've worked with, the shortest that I've had an experience of conducting competency frameworks, they ended up doing it in about 4 months. The longest took about 2 years. So I don't know if that gives you a range, but it can be dependent on what is your context, what did you want defined. Of course, the smaller the context, the quicker the process because you're going to work with less dimensions, less competencies. But the larger your context, such as strategies, the wider the number or the larger the number of your competencies. So after you do the development, from discovery to development, you now get into profiling. And this is where you begin attributing which competencies are required by certain positions. And that's done by revisiting the standards and asking which of these competencies and which of these standards are applicable for which positions. Do we require problem solving for position A? Do we require analysis for position B? And after you check that applicability, you now conduct assessment. Does the incumbent of position A now demonstrate problem solving? Do they match the standards for that competency? And again, similar to the previous steps, you will require a good number of people to come together to do each of these steps. It's not going to be an HR specific exercise, an exercise that's done with other functional groups coming together. So how do you know that it is correct? How do you know that the standards, the profiles, or the applicability that you set out are correct? Well, um, now this is not a basic lesson anymore. It's more of an advanced kind of question on competencies. But there are at least about three methods, three validation methods on how you do that. One is cross-current validity, um, and one is predictive validity. There is also cross-construct validity. And these are a little bit more technical in nature, but you simply want to test if do my high performers demonstrate these standards or are these standards realistic? Maybe a way to illustrate that is I'll get to a topic maybe later when I talk about some conflating or confusing, not conflating, sorry, but conflicting concepts or ideas in constructing a standard. I'll put out an additional slide for that, but I'll do that shortly. I'll revisit that question in a while. But again, the end discussion about this one is development takes a village. So takes a village to raise a child. So similarly, if competency you want to birth it as the framework for your HR, it will take a village to construct that. And this village is what you might call your technical working group. Might be comprised based from obviously basically your HR, but also representatives from the functional groups who have frustrations or requirements about behaviors or certain competencies, and maybe a profile of your superior performers. So altogether, these are the groups that you want to put together to do again the three steps of discovery, development, and profiling, which is not yet the end. At these three steps, you end up defining the model. The next step ultimately is to begin integrating it. So the framework now becomes your reference for when you do recruitment. The framework now becomes the reference by which you do performance or learning and development or employee relationships. In my experience, I've used competencies as a basis for doing compensation. I've used competencies as a basis for doing succession and even career paths, and there are multitude of applications of competencies. And that's because the standards are defined, the standards are clear, and they do not differ whichever function, H&R function you're doing. In terms of CSC's model, and this was an exercise that we did around 2010. And by 2010, you can maybe characterize that CSC was late to the party, but being late to the party actually is also good because that means all the dust has settled down. And when CSC entered the picture, all of the noise around how many standards, how many types, they were all sorted out. So CSA actually came into competency picture at a better time compared to other organizations. But in terms of the CSC model, they started out by asking what is CSC's mandate, what is the vision, what is the mission, what are our values, what are our strategies, and how are we doing in these. And based on this, that's when they began thinking about their construct. What do we need? What capabilities do we need to achieve the mandate? What capabilities do we need to achieve the vision? What capabilities do we need to achieve the strategy? And these constructs, they group them together. Some constructs, they call them core constructs or core competencies. Some of these constructs, they call them leadership competencies. And some of these other constructs, they call them technical competence. We spoke about these earlier. Each of these constructs were then articulated by talking about standards. So what are the standards for each of these competencies? And from here, CSC then defined profiles for certain positions. And after this defining the profiles, they used it as the reference by which to begin doing hiring, by which to do learning and development. The gap analysis was based on were people matching their profiles, their position profiles, as a basis for performance and as a basis for employee rewards. And CSC's integration to each of these systems, by the way, wasn't quick. After 2010, the initial integration began with learning and development, which is actually the typical first function where competencies are applied. And after a year, CSC applied it now into recruitment. And lately, they are now implementing it in performance as well as succession. And it's through these competencies wherein they are now experiencing some success in their vision and strategies because people are now showing the capabilities required to achieve this. So they're now seeing some fruits to their organizational outcomes. And of course, a way to validate the model will be to look at your outcomes. Are the outcomes happening? Because we define the constructs that are needed to achieve the strategy. Is it now happening? So poor production of the outcome, poor outcomes indicate that maybe we didn't define the right standards. For example, why are we not achieving our strategies yet? Why aren't we achieving our mandate yet? Well, maybe because the constructs that we define are not the right constructs that will allow us to achieve this. Maybe they're not yet complete. Maybe they're missing. Number two, maybe the standards by which we define these constructs are also insufficient. Maybe they're not the right behaviors. So you want to establish a feedback loop by which to validate if your competencies are right. And the way to validate is that your outcomes correspond to your desire by which you started this competency journey. Because another question is, are we all able to close the competency gaps? But that's another story for a later discussion. At least that's how you validate. And that's CAC's model. So a competency-based HR, in terms of recruitment, will have you answering yes to all of these questions. Because now, in terms of a vacancy, in terms of requirements, you know which competencies you look for. You know which standard you want to focus on. Your interview, because of the profile, is now very focused because you don't ask for competencies or you won't ask for evidence for capabilities that will have nothing to do with the work. So it's not a waste of time of interviews. And some interviews can be tedious. And of course, it's now more systematic because you only focus on the essential. You major on the major, you minor on the minor. So unnecessary or trivial questions such as, what do you like or what are your strengths, they become immaterial now because now it's competency based. You begin asking, are you able to demonstrate this? Are you good in problem solving? Can you break down problems into their component parts? So and so, all coming from the standards, and the constructs. In a competency-based HR, in terms of performance, your answer here is always yes. For example, now you know what influences performance. You know that somebody is not able to analyze because maybe they don't have analysis skills. Somebody is not able to perform because they lack some of the competencies needed to perform or produce a certain outcome. And because of the standards, you now also know which behaviors aren't present and which behaviors need to be coached into performance. And that is helps you establish the reasons for gaps in performance. With a competency-based HR, development is now focused. So there are, when you run a program, you know why you're running it. You're running it because it helps improve certain competencies. And you also know which standards you're focusing on. And it also becomes the framework or the backbone by which you conduct coaching and feedback. And lastly, in rewards, of course, for employees who demonstrate certain competencies which are far beyond your requirement, you can now implement certain incentives on top of that. Reward for demonstrating competencies far beyond what is required. Or a reward, you may now tag them as your key employees, which feeds into your either career or succession process. So competency-based system really does allow you to strengthen your core HR functions on their own, but it also allows you to tie them all together neatly. So there are no confusions now about did we have different standards for hiring or why did we hire this person? This person is not so good. Again, those happen because you have differing standards. Since you unify standards now because of competencies, all of your HR functions are harmonized. And that's how you develop a competency-based HR. And that's the end of our coverage. I wanted to include another slide here, which wasn't part of our initial goals of the workshop, but it might be helpful for some of you who are already in the middle of doing HR, or sorry, competencies. And these are really areas for improvement. And how can you make your competency framework even stronger? If you will recall in the earlier slide, we showed you that there were 38% of organizations that we studied which weren't successful yet in competency-based HR compared to that minority group of 8%. And when we looked at these organizations, we found that there were actually three areas where they can improve in to make really their competency-based systems um, stronger. We found out that there were issues primarily in terms of their design. Also, there were issues in terms of how they launched or cascaded or informed the rest of their organization in competencies. And also, number three, sustainability. Three is already actually a very sensational issue. Sometimes we end up doing a competency framework because ISO requires it, maybe, or some other certification requires it. And after that, we don't look at it anymore. So definitely that's something that we want to talk about. But in design issues, some of the issues have something to do with having a generic framework or a model. Number two, another design issue, which I call hardware-software conflict. I'll clarify that shortly. And letter C, or number three, a high number of behavioral standards. And letter D, conflicting criteria or profiles. In generic framework or model, for example, first let's revisit. What is a model after all, right? A model basically is really just a way of seeing something. For example, if you want to understand the employee life cycle, you want to put it in a framework. One framework might look like this, where you put them in a circle. Or you can even say the same framework and you represent it in a line. So basically, a framework is just a model by which you want to see something. For example, Maslow, when he wanted to illustrate the hierarchy of needs, and he said that you need to first satisfy physiological requirements before security requirements, before relational requirements. If you hear him talk about this, you might end up saying, maybe I can model what he's saying in terms of a ladder or a set of stairs or maybe a set of circles that go that enlargen for each step, and that's already a framework. In his case, the framework that he decided to use was a triangle or a pyramid, which illustrates how you elevate motivation as you go through these steps. So really, it's a model is really a framework is really just a model, a way of seeing things. So when you apply that, and sorry, this is just a fun representation of current of Maslow's hierarchy of needs today. Many of our kids, they don't care if they don't have water or they're not warm or they don't have enough rest. So long as they have internet, they're happy. So that's a current revision today of Maslow's hierarchy. Please don't quote me on that. It's not the real Maslow hierarchy. It's something that we just made fun of. So a framework is simply just that. So the question again goes back to one of the things that we spoke about earlier, the context, the why. Why are you doing a competency framework? And some of the answers that we had earlier was maybe we're doing a competency model because we want to achieve the strategy, or we want to achieve the mandate, or we want to increase organization effectiveness, or we want to improve our expertise. These, by the way, are the more typical or um, popular reasons for wanting to um, develop a competency model. I'll give you some example. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It looks like a swoosh. Maybe some of you are wearing this shoe today. It's a brand that during the late 70s, early 80s, we pronounced differently. We said we call this brand uh, Nike, but today we've been corrected. We know it's pronounced Nike. It's actually not a swoosh, but a letter V, because Nike is the goddess of victory. So it's a stylized letter V. Anyway, there was a situation, and I hope you don't mind if I do some storytelling here. There was a time in the early 80s where Nike wasn't as the company that they were today. If you know your history, if there are those of you listening who've been teenagers around this time, the early 80s, Nike was not a popular shoe brand. It wasn't a shoe that many of us wanted to have. It was that unpopular. In the early 80s, Nike was really just producing um, basketball shoes, which resemble today's sneakers, and also walking shoes. They were really just two basic products. And also because it was a side business. Nike's primary business was distribution. So that was what they were competent in, distribution. They were distributing a shoe called Onitsuka Tiger, very expensive shoes. And on the side, they were doing, again, those basketball shoes and sneakers. But in the 80s also came the prominence of this other sport brand that became popular because an artist called Olivia Newton-John wore most of their apparel, and she wore those apparel while she was singing a song that was shown over MTV. Now, just to illustrate this, because of MTV, of course, you know, they got a lot of attention. Because it was Olivia Newton-John, there was a lot of star power. And because she was wearing, this sport brand, everybody wanted to emulate her. And what was this shoe brand? Reebok. So Reebok at that time in the 80s was really, really very popular. It owned the a large chunk of the market. It was very profitable in terms of revenue. It was sky high. And Nike, being a distributor company then, they wanted to be Reebok. And they knew they weren't. And to do that, they needed to transform themselves. So they defined a new strategy. And this strategy was, and you can read about this is actually true in many of Nike's literature. Their strategy was number one, they articulated in a vision statement. And the vision was be the number one sports brand in the world. And their mission statement was annihilate Reebok. So you can imagine as you enter a Nike company, there were all these posters, annihilate Reebok. So they were all doing this rah-rah around transformation. But they also knew that to achieve this strategy of being number one and annihilating Reebok required certain capabilities. And their capabilities then was different. The capabilities they had wouldn't give them that number one spot. The capabilities they had then wouldn't give them an ability to annihilate Vito. Because, again, as a distribution company, they were good in distribution. They were good in relationship management. They were good in business analytics. But they didn't have the skill for product development. They were only making sneakers then. They didn't have the skill for they didn't have research because they didn't know what's a good quality of rubber that will make a buyer move from Reebok to Nike. So that told them to achieve this strategy, we need to acquire new competencies. To achieve this strategy, we need to be good in research and development. To achieve this strategy, we need to do design and development. To achieve this strategy, we need to do product development. To achieve this strategy, we want to begin focusing on customers and also to be innovative and also to be good at marketing because Olivia Newton-John was very popular. Reebok was very popular because of Olivia Newton-John. And Olivia Newton-John, because of M2V, had so much presence. So what's a good way to talk about, to get people's attention and look at Nike? So definitely, they had to market. And they had to make a strong presence, a really good branding element. So here in this simple illustration, the context of Nike for their competency framework was strategy. And the competencies or the constructs that they needed to have were these: research, design, product, customer. So these were the competencies that Nike wanted to have to achieve the strategy. And ergo, the framework is modeled around these competencies. So how do you organize that framework? In Nike's case, they focus on branding as the key, as the zero domino competency by which triggers all of these competencies. And this is how they illustrated their framework. So it was really just again, a drawing of all of these competencies with branding as the middle competency based on their, again, key context, which was strategy. Another organization, such as OCD, their concern was that we're building a competency model because we want to fulfill our mandate, which is why this is how they defined their competencies. And their competencies were about to fulfill their mandate, which was about disaster risk reduction. The competencies they needed to have were disaster and risk communication, damage and needs assessment analysis, resource mobilization. And the way they illustrated that was simply through circles. We won't call this a Venn because it's not a Venn diagram, although it resembles one, but simply circles of three competency sets. One other organization wanted to do competencies because they wanted to create organization effectiveness. And to do that, they identified competencies which they felt were needed at a foundation level. We spoke about this earlier: leadership competencies and core competencies. So they need to be good in all of this to achieve or be effective as an organization. And if you'd like to guess, this obviously is a water-based company because they illustrated their framework in terms of water droplets. This is actually MWS's competency model. And still another another organization wanted to do two things. Their context for their competency framework was both to fulfill the mandate and also to achieve organization effectiveness. And this company is called GCG, wherein, in terms of their mandate, these were the competencies they said that they should be good at. And in terms of their organization to move about as a really good organization, these are the competencies they needed to do. In the middle were competencies that they felt should be present to do both organization effectiveness and fulfill the mandate. So really, it's really just a model, which is why it's why it's a gap right now for many organizations, because their model is so generic that it's just a list of competencies, but it doesn't give an illustration of how are these competencies grouped or why are they important. Here, this is a very popular one. It's available over the internet. You can visit ATD, or it used to be ASTD. But simply, their framework reads this way: that if you are a consultant of ATD, you need to have these competencies and at least one area of expertise. So it's a very, very practical model that is really clear to understand. And they illustrated it in the form of a diamond or on top of a pedestal or a foundation. So that's one. So that's one of the flaws of those who are entering into competencies. They don't think deeply about the context. Ergo, the framework is shoddy. The framework is not so strong. There is no compelling reason of why we need these competencies. They didn't answer the question, do we want these competencies because we want to achieve the strategy? Do we want these competencies to achieve the mandate? Another error has something to do with hardware software conflict. And this is a term that I just created, but a way to illustrate this would be to think about, well, simply our PCs, our computers. Maybe for some of us, in terms of our computer, it's a Windows based device, and that's your hardware. If, for example, for this Windows based device, the operating system that I want to install is a Mac software. Obviously, these two won't work together because they are in conflict. The right software for a Windows hardware is a Windows software. So how does this lend into the competency discussion? In competency discussion, we call the hardware the culture of the organization or the climate of the organization, or maybe the characteristics of the organization. The software are the standards that we introduce. To illustrate this, maybe let's talk about a standard. Maybe the standard or the software you want to introduce goes this way. Let's say it's a standard under performance management, and your standard is provides feedback in a timely and professional manner. As a standard, it sounds good, right? It has a specific verb, provides. There's a there's a condition by which you specify timely and appropriate feedback. But when you look at the hardware, the condition, the climate, this is where you begin validating the standard. For example, think of the Filipino culture. When it comes to feedback, when a Pinoy has an issue with a fellow Pinoy, you know the attitude is not giving direct feedback. Currently, our culture is more conflict conflict averse. We don't want conflicts. So ergo, when I have an issue with somebody, I will not tell you my issue. I'll tell it to somebody else, or I'll keep my mouth shut. Given that this is the culture, this is the hardware, you know that the software might take some time to be to be realized in that kind of environment. So here you will see there is a hardware software conflict. The behavior or the standard you're expecting is not conducive to that organization. Maybe some of your standards might in one competency such as communication, you expect everybody to writes documents following the rules of grammar. But the kind of employees you hire, and that's the hardware, are not college graduates. They're high school graduates. So their English is not as sophisticated as your requirement. So ergo, by that, you will see conflicts in hardware and software. So it's important that you think about this, especially if the way you're arriving at standards, you're simply copying, or your aspired for behaviors are really just so high. So you want to make standards which are closer to reality, which are closer to the climate, which are closer to the standard. And then in another year, that's the time when you make the standard a little bit higher. So that's hardware software conflict. Many do not succeed in their competency approach because of this. Number two, number three, high number of standards. To do this, I need some cooperation from you if you're still there. Hello. So if you're still there, if you can just do this with your hands, can you close and can you clasp them quickly? So some of you might have it different. No? Some of you might have your right thumb over your left thumb, or some of you might have your left thumb over your right thumb, which is what I want you to do now. However your hands are placed right now, could you simply change the placement? So if you are left over right in terms of thumbs, can you do it right over left? And if you are right over left, just change it left over right. Right. So here's a question I have. In terms of that change, how do you feel? Is it comfortable or is there some discomfort in adjusting to what you're used to? If you're used to left over right, obviously you will definitely you might feel some discomfort if you change that to right over left, right? Because again, you're not used to it. When we talk about standards, that's precisely what we're doing. We're trying to illustrate behaviors that we want that we think are not present. But here, if the discomfort, if you already feel discomfort about one thumb, if you change the placement of your entire hands and the rest of the fingers, you will see that the discomfort is much more pronounced. So very simply, what this means is that if you have a lot of standards that you require for certain competencies, then there's a lot of adjustments definitely for people whom you want to demonstrate these competencies or these standards. And the more adjustments there are, the harder for them to actually make that adjustment or do this transformation. Because again, there will be discomfort. There will be some awkward feeling about this adjustment. So when you make standards for competencies, just a few number of standards should be sufficient, not as much. In fact, there is no written rule about how many standards. In my recommendation, in my practice, just one standard is sufficient. Just getting everybody, look, the example earlier we made about this organization that I visited. Why was their standard simply just one for communication? Why was it just simply writes in a manner that is casual and conversational? Well, maybe because in terms of their hardware, nobody is able to converse casual or conversational. So that standard is sufficient enough for their purpose for now. Once everybody meets that standard, then there's no stopping you from improving the standards for next year. Next year, that's when you look for cohesion. Next year, that's when you look for logic. Next year, that's when you look for following grammar. So you want to look for standards that are sufficient in number, so not too high, not too many. In some tables, competency tables that I've seen, I've seen competencies wherein the standards or behaviors are around 5. In my experience, that's too high. And I'll tell you why also. Maybe you will say it's not too high, but in the next session, you'll see why that could also pose some conflicts if it's more than 2 or 3 standards. Number one, if the standards are not related to the culture, hardware, software conflict, that's a gap already. Number two, high number of standards, there's a conflict there. And number three, if the criteria, if the standards are conflicting. What do we mean by this one? Let's talk about 2 personalities. Let's say the extrovert personality and the introverted personality. When you talk of the extroverted personality, an extrovert would be able to demonstrate these behaviors easily because that's how they solve problems through discussion. They always want to be talking to people. In terms of looking for sources of ideas, they always want to look outside. They always want to turn to another. That's an extrovert, right? It's always outward looking. An introvert, meanwhile, is inward looking. So they think things through before speaking. They're quiet. They don't go through. They don't do discussion. That's not their first choice to solve a dilemma or solving a situation. They demonstrate a keen self awareness because they don't look outward. They look inward. Introverted personality actually is more prone for introspection. So these are 2 different standards, 2 different behaviors. But surprisingly, I've seen some competencies wherein these standards appear as one set required for maybe a competency such as problem solving. So in problem solving, your standard is you want people to solve problems through discussion. You want people to look to others or outside to source ideas or inspirations. Oh, but you also want them to think things through. Well, guess what? They're conflicting criteria because why? The extrovert will always be able to demonstrate the first 2 behaviors. The introvert will always be able to demonstrate quite easily the last 2 behaviors. So already here, it's conflicting. If you shrink your standards to about not 4, but maybe just 3 or 2, then it might be easier for your introvert to adjust to another behavior or your extrovert to adjust to another behavior. So quite simply, That's another reason by why some competencies or some competency frameworks are not succeeding. And if you put them together, that creates for you a perfect storm, right? Design issues, a generic framework, hardware software conflict, high number of behavioral standards, and conflicting criteria or profiles. But let's say you don't have any of these issues, and then you ask, why am I still not succeeding? And maybe it has something to do with your launch. And by launch issues, we are referring to how did you introduce the competencies? Do people know how to read a competency framework? Do people understand standards? Or do you yourself, as an HR professional, understand how you came up with the standards? Because if not, then of course, then the uptake, the buy-in will not be as significant as you would have wanted. And also, B, after establishing the framework, you don't embed it into your system. Or if you do embed it into your system, you're only embedding it in one HR system. Maybe you implement it just in training development. And a way to test this, if you implement it in recruitment, that makes you even better in asking, do we have the right model? Are these the right standards? It's only when you do the embedding in HR systems do you see some clarity in your framework. So those are, again, the launch issues. Number three, also areas for improvement, sustainability. So Lito, how come I don't get to that point where I'm part of that 8%? Seeing the 45 improvement in revenue, seeing the 41% improve in customer retention. Maybe it has something to do not with your design issues or your launch issues, but maybe in your sustainability issues. Maybe in terms of accountability or ownership, there is no one in HR who owns that process of competencies. That they look at it every day to see, are these the right standards? Do we need to change the standards? Do we need to update the standards? Maybe currently, in terms of sustainability, there is no process by which you evaluate or update your competencies. Maybe when you design your competency framework in 2010, that's still the same framework you're using today. What if the standards that are already there have been you've been meeting those standards already there? Isn't it time to change the standards now? Maybe if you change your strategy, isn't it time to question, are these the competencies we need or are there new competencies now? And maybe in terms of changes, does it pose some impact or effect on your competencies? I'll give you a secret. Sometimes you can test the strength of your competency framework by the amount of impact or effort or let's say force that challenges it. What are these forces? For example, if there are staffing changes, these have an effect in your competency model. If there are systems, let's say you acquire an HRIS or you acquire a new software for finance or your IT decided to automate certain parts, that changes competencies, that changes standards. Your HR will no longer demonstrate standards such as reviews or reviews, pace, and validates if they are right or correct. They will no longer be required to do that because the system takes care of it. So you want to update your framework already. Maybe also your structure has changed. If your structure has changed, then maybe other competencies are no longer relevant for certain positions. So these pose changes to your competency framework. Also, if you change your strategy, just like Nike before was distribution, it shifted to a manufacturer. So that posed changes in their competency framework. And maybe the style of your leader. The styles of a leader definitely have an impact to what are the competencies required. Maybe your previous leader, your previous administrator wasn't into the nitty-gritty. So ergo, um, attention to detail was not a key competency required across all. But now your new administrator is that kind of person. So suddenly, it's a new capability that you require. And maybe also skill, the uptake of skills. So we qualify the first three as changes that might have significant impact on your competency framework. But the last three, they also have impact to your competency framework, but only They only post minimal changes. And if this looks familiar, it actually is based on McKinsey 7S, the last S being shared values, which will no longer reflect here. Shared values is produced by the hard SS, strategy, structure, systems, and the soft SS, staffing, style, and skill. But this is was what I wanted to add because again, maybe for those of you who are currently doing competencies and you're attending these classes because you want to check if am I doing it right? Why aren't we seeing the kind of things that Lito spoke about as the results of a competency-based HR? Strong functional units and unified or harmonious units. Maybe it has something to do with the following: your design, your launch, and your sustainability. But if you do have this, and guess what? Um, Maybe it's just a matter of strengthening, cascading, implementing, or being brave about really transforming your HR into one that is competency based. Finally, change your framework by which you do your HR. Make it now competency based. So those are that's my just the additional slide for that. We're going to include it in our final set of slides that we will post over the internet, I think, on the website. But now we want to shift into your questions because I think we do have time for questions. Minutes. All right, just a few minutes. Sorry, questions. So we have. Um, all right. So how do we do this? All right. This is a very easy question. Is it possible to get a copy of the material after the webinar? Yes, definitely we will provide that. Next. How do you measure, sorry, how do you measure a competency? I think briefly we spoke about this. There are several ways of measuring competencies. Many organizations do the survey method. Many organizations do the test method. And these are ways of measuring competencies. But you also should know that the best measure is always the one that gives you demonstrated evidence. So you cannot count on inferred evidence, meaning just because you saw somebody uh, give you a good report, your immediate evaluation is this person is competent in writing and reporting. You want to see that person actually do the writing to say in a conclusive and an affirmative manner that they really are competent in writing. So it's always demonstration, which is why the better methods for assessing or measuring competencies are through either assessment methods, assessment center, observation, and even to a degree, maybe we can include behavioral event interview. Although interview, in many studies, the correlation of its effectiveness in terms of competency prediction is about 0.44. If you're in psychology, you know that that's not an ideal score. You're always looking for a perfect one or close to one. But currently in the world, wherever you look, there is no tool that conducts perfect prediction or perfect competency measure. The closest, however, is assessment center. Usually at either, in many studies, it's at 0.68, so that's close to 1, or 0.72. And if you want to learn more about this, just simply type over at Google assessment reliability, and you'll get a shock of your life because now some of the traditional methods we use, such as basing competency strength on education, it's the least effective method. So on. Hopefully that answered the question. What is the relationship of having a competency-based HR system to an agency's productivity? Well, I don't have the right figures for actual productivity in terms of organization, but you did see a slide earlier where we showed improvements in some organizations that have done outright competency improvements, such as, if you would recall, the 55% increase in revenue, 45% increase in customer retention, 41% increase in customer satisfaction. So these are actual productivity metrics, and they were the result of organizations um, implementing or doing a competency-based approach to their HR. Just think about it. If you hire the right person based on competencies and standards, then that person obviously will perform and contribute eventually to customer satisfaction. If you hire the right person that you require to do analysis, that person will produce good analysis work, and that analysis work might contribute to revenue or any of your other performance outcomes. From design to launch, what is the ideal timeline? Breathe in, breathe out. It has to do again with the context. So the question is, why are you doing your competency? Why are you doing a competency framework? The larger your context, the bigger your context, the longer it might take. So if your context is strategy, because I want to achieve our strategy, you can end up arriving at a long list of competencies or constructs. But if your objective is to improve performance of certain positions, that's just a finite number of competencies. Your development time might be shorter. Um, in my experience, for example, I know organizations, I can mention some of them, DENR, it took them about 2 years to develop their competency framework. Um, the shortest was GCG, the Governance Commission of the Governance Commission for GOCCs. On a private setting, if there are those of you from the private sector listening, in my experience, I did competency frameworks for call centers in a year. Zurich Pharmacy, for example, 1 year for each functional unit. So we did 1 year development for competencies for the distribution division, 1 year for developing competencies for the sales division, 1 year for developing competencies for the IT division. And it took that long, a year per division. So you have a guess that it's not yet complete. But it's taking that long because we're doing this development on an Asia Pacific region. So that's why it's long. So I don't know if that gives you a ballpark, but definitely it will take some time. And again, a key component would be a team. A team, what you call a technical working group, comprised of HR primarily, some representatives from key units, and also functional your um, ideal or superior performers. So I would say if you want a ballpark, I would say a year would be good enough, regardless of context. But that's a year of full-time competency development. So in other words, you tell your boss, I won't do all of these other work that I'm doing because I'm going to focus on competencies. That's when I say in confidence that you can achieve it in a year. How can you reconcile competency-based HR with equal employment opportunity principles required by prime HRM, particularly on recruitment selection? Well, actually, because of the standards, your criteria are not based on other criteria such as um, sex-based standards, um, education-based standards. It's always based on behavior. So regardless if you are male, female, old or young, so long as you match a competency, then you're acceptable. So a competency-based system of HR actually introduces or clarifies or creates that equal opportunity setting. Because again, today we have frowned, so we doubt people. If you're 60, I don't think we should be promoting you. But so long as they can perform, or you're from this school, I don't think we should accept you. Those are not equal opportunity kinds of standards. But if your recruitment was based on just competencies and standards, regardless of school, regardless of age, they can pass through that gate. So you might say competencies are an equal opportunity manner, method of um, doing um, competencies. And then last question is the technical working group a role exclusive for management? And I guess by management, you mean top management. Please write this down, capital N, capital O. No, it is not a exclusive to management. Because management might not also be conscious of their own behaviors that are detrimental to an organization's effectiveness, and maybe the people down the line might voice some of their aspirations or frustrations about manager behaviors as well, that might serve as good standards for better leaders. So So you want to include other members apart from the executive team as part of your technical working group. There are a lot more questions. I think we ended up coming up with 10,000. Sorry, I misread that. That's just 10. But we don't have time for them. But you do know that CSE and PMAP, they're conducting workshops on competency. So if you want to get deeper into this, that's a way for you to learn more about. But hopefully by this quick session, it increases your confidence that you can get into competencies because it's fairly easy. Keyword, just define your what, define your context, your constructs, and then your standards. That's the zero domino for competency development. Thank you very much for your kind attention and your silence. So I'm just making fun. I love this session, and let's see each other again. Thank you.